I want to use this video kind of as a follow up to some of the recent blog posts that I posted about the racial experiences I'm having in the classical education movement. Throughout this video, I'll say CCE, which represents classical education, Christian classical education movement. It's a battle because I feel like there are some really wonderful people with good, solid hearts in this movement. I think Frederick Douglass, though, really explained how the racist history of our country has affected all of us in his first autobiography, when he not only is telling his story, but also told the story of the master's wife and how she went from a woman who was able to see him and see him. She was a woman who saw him. She noticed him. She noticed how bright he was, how willing he was to learn. She saw him and she tried to pass on to him something that was important to her because she saw him in that moment as equal. She had never owned slaves before. And he did such a beautiful job describing how the culture that he was in transformed her and then also held her captive. And I have chosen to view the times that we're in not so much through the lens that everything around us is racist, everything around us is white supremacist, but instead, it's a more gracious way of looking at it, but it helps me. We all, in some way, our mentality, our way of being in the world, in the space, affects how we relate to one another, how we see one another. On a Black person's side, because we do consistently go through racist experiences, whether you believe it or not, and whether you're a preacher or pastor or school leader or religious leader or leader tells you it's not true. I don't care if a Black person tells you that's not true. We do really experience racism. And I just want you to process that. I don't care what anybody in your political party says. These are not paranoid experiences where we're just making this up or misunderstanding. We do go through pretty blatant racist experiences on a regular basis. And so of our parents, so of our parents' parents. And we really, as America, never got rid of the spirit of racism. The Civil War did not end the spirit of racism. The Civil Rights Act did not end the spirit of racism. The hearts of people haven't fully changed, meaning that someone has to step in and say, no, this way of being and thinking and seeing the world has to stop, and now we're going to do this differently. If someone in your family line has not done that or gone through that epiphany, their hearts have not changed. My father had to step out of his life experiences and say, Anika, yes, you are Black. Yes, you should be proud of who you are. Yes, racism still exists, but you are to always relate in the spirit of love and with a desire to find unity, even if you have to have the hard conversations. You do not segregate. You do not run from addressing racism. You can hold people accountable or be clear on how their actions are making you feel without being angry and hateful and bitter. And at the end of the day, all of your work, what God commands us to do, is to seek healing and unity and love. My father had to be the one to step out, my mother too, had to step out of their human experiences and step out of maybe how their community may have responded to things and say, this is how our children now will do this. And just like that had to happen to me, that had to happen to white people. If no one in your family line from 1619 to now has not either stepped out and said, hey, we no longer treat Black people as if they're inferior And that seems pretty simple. But here's another aspect of it. Hey, we no longer, we from now on, our family will see Black people. We will see them as equal. We will see them as equal participants in the work of humanity that we're engaged with. We will include their voices and their presence because they have just as much to offer. No, we are not the superior ones who are here just to help them or raise them up. We are here to partner with. And there's other ways to change your thinking, but if someone hasn't done that in your family line and either had that epiphany or had that conversation to switch up the narrative that you and your ancestors have been taught, you probably, no matter how wonderful you are plagued by the disease of racism, even in your most unconscious thoughts, even if you have a heart of love. And so the difference between racial healing and racial reconciliation is racial healing, I feel, is the first process. It's the process of the general act of healing the relationships between Blacks and whites. It has been broken. It's been broken since my ancestors were snatched from the continent of Africa. Sadly, that act not only broke up the relationships between Blacks and whites, but it also hurt the relationships between Black people, because Black people participated in that when different tribes would sell off other tribes to European people into slavery. A spirit of distrust for one another has also been birthed in our community, where we don't usually work together or support one another. There's usually a competition sometimes. Well, I don't want to say usually. There's sometimes a competition in communities, a distrust that is present in Black communities that's not always present in other ethnic groups. And then once we got here to America, we would sell each other out on the plantation to self-preserve. Frederick Douglass tells a story of wanting to escape and how the first time a fellow slave told the master, and he had to literally eat the evidence that he was going to use. I think he had written a pass or something to be able to because Black people had to use a pass to leave the plantation. So I think he had written one up his first attempt, and another slave told on him. And so we do that. We will distance ourselves from one another to preserve our relationships in the white community. That's our side. And I'm being open and honest because I want everyone to see how this just all affects us. And so a lot of times, if you see a person of color who will say, oh, there's no racism, we need to just forgive, blah, 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 a lot of times they don't even realize that they are functioning in that spirit of self-preservation from the plantation. They have the same attitude of the Black man who was with those who killed Emmett Till and actually told the white men where Emmett Till was staying. And the list goes on. So racism is hurting. It hurts Black communities. It continues to hurt Black communities. I know when I was working on my PhD in a predominantly white university, there were Black people there. And if a Black person recognized that another Black person was struggling with racism, they would not, no matter, I would try to reach out, but we would not bond together. We wouldn't organize. We wouldn't comfort one another. And if we did, it was always done in secret because you would be afraid that if those in power saw these relationships, maybe our position in the PhD program would not be what it needs to be to get out self-preservation. So that was a very isolating experience. This is why I love HBCUs. It's such a safe space. I hope everyone's understanding me. I'm breaking down how racism is broken all of us. And then in the white community, if you haven't been taught that we're equal, so it's okay to marry someone outside your race, or it's okay to work with, it's okay to appoint someone to leadership in a white organization. And that appointment doesn't mean that Black people are not inferior, that we have the same amount of intellect and experience to lead efforts. But see, I don't think there's too many people today who would say, I don't want a Black person to do XYZ. But it's in the subconscious just to see a group of people, to have a work that you're doing. The Black person is there, but you know that they do, they have the skills to do some things to really help your efforts or work grow, showing biblical diversity. You may see them, but you will choose the white person who's doing it as opposed to the Black person with the same skill, serving the same community, who has the same ability to do the work. You would choose the white person. That happens many times, not because you hate us, not because you're even constantly saying, oh, I don't want that Black person to do it. I prefer the white person to help lead diversity efforts or whatever. It's because your brain, because someone hasn't had the important conversation to get you out of that racist trance that has held us captive since 1619, say to you, I see the Black person. They are valuable. They have the skills I need to do this. Let's use them and bring them into the work we're doing. Instead, what you'll do is say, let me ask all the people I feel comfortable with who look like me to serve that community, and say to the Black community, see, look, we are helping you. Hey, look, we want to invite you to come watch us do this work that we really could use your help with. It's that deep. Doesn't mean you're hateful. Doesn't mean you're racist. This doesn't mean that you haven't either had the epiphany yet or the important conversation from your community to change the thinking that has been a part of all of us since 1619, since we started being taken from the continent. So racial healing is about a group of us saying, we're not going to run from this anymore. We're not going to deny this anymore. We're not going to pretend this doesn't exist anymore. We're not going to put up these happy facades as if the world is perfect now that the Civil War happened, we're all a union, and Martin Luther King stood next to Lyndon B. Johnson to sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Black people do vote sometimes. Hearts of people have to change to really change racism. Legislation can't even really change racism. It helps some, but when you still have people's hearts who haven't changed be the ones to try to carry out that legislation, then it's done in a white supremacist way. We really have to change the hearts of people, and it's hard because a lot of people are stuck. A lot of people really struggle to see that they are still held captive. Racial healing is about a group of us saying, we are going to humble ourselves. I'm humbling myself. I'm saying, and I'm teaching my students, I'm teaching my children, I'm teaching my community, those who want to listen to me, we need to change. 2, we are not just the ones who've been hurt. We have and we continue to be, but our elevation comes with recognizing that we also have a responsibility and that we need to be healed from what racism has done to us. And then we recognize that healing process cannot happen, will not happen, without connecting with our white brothers and sisters. The act of segregating and empowering yourselves without them, actually, that's not even biblical. That's the first thing. That's not, I don't want the Lord to come back and I'm doing that. He's going to be looking like, this is not what heaven's going to be like. What are you doing? So I'm like, hey, Jesus, you see me? I'm trying to bring biblical unity. I may be doing it messy. I may not always do it right, but you know my heart. I want to bring healing. I want him to see me doing the work of healing. I'm not waiting for people to do it before me. I'm not waiting for people to do it after they've apologized to me. I'm doing it now. And I'm running after it. Just like Jesus ran after me in my mess, I'm running after connecting with my white brothers and sisters in spite of what I go through, because that's what God wants me to do. That's racial healing. That's all of us saying we're doing that. We're going to heal ourselves and we're going to do it together. And we're going to break free from these chains that racism has put on all of us. And we're changing our thinking and we're changing our hearts and we're changing our actions and we're seeing one another through the lens of grace. And we're progressing forward together. That's racial healing. That's the big work. What is racial reconciliation? That's within the big work. So in this journey that for me started when my parents decided to put my brother and I in predominantly white Christian schools, that was my father's way of doing the work. It definitely wasn't his way of assimilating because we had to go to these schools and our parents, my mom and dad, would teach us, hey, if you hear this, always say this in class. For example, if someone says to you, it is sinful for black people and white people to be married, you are to say, no, Moses married a black woman. Like you are to say things out loud in class as little children. We weren't even in junior high. Whenever you hear racist theology or racist thought or racist perspectives, don't settle for it. I had a teacher that would pick up, this is when I was in elementary school, in a Christian school, and she would just randomly think of reasons to send black kids to be paddled for no reason. And my parents got wind of it, and they had a choice. They could have pulled us out of the school. And my father instead, and mother, decided to tell the principal, under no circumstances are you ever allowed to paddle our children. Now, this is the 70s, y'all. Christian schools did paddling, 70s and 80s. Under no circumstances, you better not ever lay a hand on our children. And so when this teacher would send us to the office, I could see it now. That white principal would look so helpless and just have a little conversation and send us on back. And then literally, I guess they would have called my parents for what they thought was a concern. Both my father would take off work, my parents would go, and they would come. They would take me out of the classroom. They would hug me, and then we would go in together to talk to this principal, and they would confront that principal. And they did that throughout my childhood in these Christian schools. And I believe this act was an act of activism. Instead of pulling us out, they made us stay in the schools, and they had made us fight to be seen. So when my school said, you're not allowed to have a gospel choir, me and my friends protested, and we ended up with having a gospel choir. When my school said you cannot celebrate Black History Month, my sister-in-law, who grew up with us, put up Black History posters all around the walls. And we would have teachers tear them down, and we would keep doing it until they eventually allowed us to celebrate it. Why am I sharing this with you? Well, that was the big work. That was the work of racial healing, which also involves activism. But we stayed. And in staying, we developed relationships with teachers, students, parents that may have started out this process not wanting us there, seeing us as inferior, rejecting us. But in staying there and healing started to happen, relationships were formed. And so I learned from my last school. I went there from 7th to 12th grade, Riverdale Baptist School in Upper Marlboro. We stayed there and we worked through the racism. We worked through that year. The board and leadership of the school decided to expel every Black person in the school, and our parents had to protest to get us back in. Instead of the parents saying, okay, we'll just go someplace else, they decided to say, no, we deserve to be here just like anybody else. And we protested, and we all were let back in. Craziness. These are in my memory. I'm only 49. So we stayed there. Relationships were formed. Teachers began to have hearts that changed. Students, parents, leaders, principals, hearts began to change. Black people's hearts began to change. We started to trust. We started to be open to the idea of having a relationship with those who have tried to oppress us. And we became friends. And I'm still friends with many of those teachers and students and classmates today. But in the course of that relationship, the old ugly head of racist thinking does raise up. something happens, something insensitive is said, the relationship is broken. The relationship that was healed begins to move forward, but the old way of thinking creeps back in, and the relationship becomes broken again. Instead of storming off and saying, "Oh, white people are racist, I'm through with you," you come back together and you reconcile. And I did that a lot growing up in Christian schools. And Riverdale Baptist was so amazing because before Riverdale Baptist, other white Christian schools would not allow for healing and reconciliation. And so after years, several years of my parents trying to do that, they would eventually say, I remember these conversations, "Well, we've done all we can do here. We're going to a new school." And what would often happen is, and this happened because of my family and because of the families that partnered together in this process, we would all usually leave together and go to another school. So our last school, a big group of us went there. We left one Christian school and went to another. But Riverdale Baptist is different because they were resistant too, but they allowed themselves to go through the healing process. And I was a part of that. And I watched hearts change and relationships form. And we all grew, and we actually became extremely close. And so today, that same Christian school is where my nephew, they allow my students to play. My nephew and some other students that go to Living Water School, my students, because last year we didn't have a team, they allowed our students to come play basketball. That school is now very diverse, but a lot of the same teachers are still there. It's amazing. And we watched that process. We went from, no, you can't have a gospel choir, to them asking the gospel choir to sing in the chapel. It was a beautiful process. And relationships were formed and healed. But again, as we're continuing this work of healing, the friendships that are formed in the process do get hurt because we all are still plagued by the disease of racism, and we say and do things that are rooted in that to one another, and the relationship becomes broken. But instead of giving up, you do the work of reconciliation. And so going to Riverdale, we continue to do the work of reconciliation over and over and over until a relationship was so formed and so strong that we are all still friends today. We may not always agree, but we have reconciled. That old way definitely has gone, and we're connected. So today, in the larger work of racial healing, I do experience hurt within the classical Christian education community, the CCE community, because even those with the most beautiful hearts sometimes do things that reveals to me there is still that plague. It's not, I'm not saying that they're racist. I'm not saying that they have evil intent or malice towards me. It's just that because there's just a way of moving through the world where you may not think initially to draw people of color with the expertise and experience and passion for the same things you are. If you see a person of color who can do that, it is a natural instinct to gravitate to those who look like you to do it with you. But part of the racial healing process involves pulling in and this becoming a diverse effort. And I mean diverse in the way that it's meant before the political craziness now. So I'm not going to let go of that word because people don't like it now, because it's been around since forever. And so what I'm experiencing in classical Christian education is there are these, I speak probably at a different place every month, sometimes a couple times in the same month. Even with that, we experience, hey, we're in control here, we're leading this effort here. Can you come speak? As opposed to, hey, can you come partner with us in this work? We want to include you in the conversations that strategize for how we move forward in this organization, in this school, in this space, in this organization. Instead, it's we are going to decide who we want, and most of them will look like me. We will do it here because that's what I unconsciously do. And then we'll invite you to come, as opposed to, hey, join with us. That happens a lot to us in classical Christian education. It's the reason why you have sometimes classical Christian schools that want to reach diverse communities, but don't think that it's necessary to include diverse materials. It's not hate. It's not racism even. It's the disease still plaguing the heart and mind that they're unable to see that representation is important. And the reason they can't see it is because they always see representation for themselves. They always see themselves in the curriculum, in the literature, in the work. So they can't feel what it feels like to constantly see materials where you don't see yourself in the Bible stories, in history, because they've never had to go through the process of reading school materials where they're not represented. So they're unable to empathize with that need because they've never had to experience it. And so the work of racial healing involves taking a hold of that empathy. And it doesn't mean you're woke. It just simply means that you care. Like Jesus saw Zacchaeus, saw the woman at the well, saw the leper, saw the Gentile, saw Matthew, saw the disciples that he called. We must see one another, especially when they know they can join in the work and help us in the work that we're doing. We must be intentional about that. For me, I have efforts where I have brought in at least half of my staff doesn't look like me. And we're working on a video to show the diverse staff that we have. We are bringing in students that don't look like me, white, Jewish, Asian. We have single parents, nuclear families. We have families that have different beliefs. Even though we love the Lord, we are a Christian school, we do want to show that we see people as human, as equally human. We share the gospel openly. We share the standard of God's word openly. But we also move forward in the spirit of love and grace to see people. I'm not saying you have to do that because that could be tricky. Bringing in different belief systems into a Christian setting, you have to have like this whole mission statement and this constant training of staff. It's hard because you want to make sure that as you do that, you are always clear on who you are in Jesus Christ and where you stand. That could be hard. So I'm not saying you have to do that, but at the minimum, you should at least be welcoming to people who have a different shade of skin. If you could just start with that, that would be everything. And so racial reconciliation is my process within the work of racial healing to restore my relationships with people that I have had concerns about and how people relate to people of color in this movement. And every blog post, every video, every conversation, every phone call, every text message, every email, everything I'm doing is not me it's definitely not me wanting the approval of white people, because I really would prefer not to have to do the work of racial healing. It's easier to be comfortable with those who just look like me. But I know that God's will in heaven is to seek unity amongst my brothers and sisters in Christ. So everything I do is with an effort of racial reconciliation, not division, but reconciliation. And so I want to do that publicly, and I'm going to do that publicly. And I'm going to have this messy conversation publicly. And it's going to be messy, and relationships are going to be broken, and I'm not going to run away. I'm going to keep moving forward to try to restore broken relationships, and we're going to keep moving forward together with anyone who's willing to join me. And I'm not going anywhere, because I was raised not to go anywhere. I was raised to stay until healing and reconciliation happens. And so those who are following me, who are listening to me, who are reading me, and there are going to be some of you who think I'm a danger to this work because I keep bringing up this conversation. But there's this really interesting chapter in Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. And he says, it's like an allegory where the girl who's running away from slavery ends up in this town that's really beautiful, and everyone's really happy. And she's hiding in kind of like this little crawl space, and she could see through the peephole the outside world, and she sees people in beautiful gowns, and everyone is so friendly, and it looks so sunny and bright. And for a minute she's tempted to say, maybe they're nice and I can come out and they'll be nice to me. But she decides to stay in the crawl space to continue to observe. And then at sundown, all those loving, wonderful people who've been so happy with themselves lynch someone. And all the goodness and the beauty that she saw looks different now. And as people, we've often done that, right? I remember one time realizing that as much as I loved the show Leave It to Beaver, it was happening during a time where I wasn't allowed. People like me were not allowed on the show. And so all the smiles and beautiful churches and beautiful, crisp and clean Christian schools you may have that everyone seems so happy. And you have diverse people there who do not see themselves anywhere in the space or any effort to welcome them or see them in the space. It doesn't matter how happy you are, how perfect everything may seem. That space is not what God would have it to be until that is addressed. And you can do it now in this time period of grace, or you can stand before God and try to explain to him why you didn't do your part. I'm not trying to have that conversation with the Lord, and I hope you're not either.